Hello, and welcome to the 7th installment of our webinar series. And the topic for this video is how to toggle among theory, literature, and your research question. My name is Rahul Mitra. I'm from Wayne State University. So you know what your paper wants to do, right? And you think you have the right set of theories that will help you accomplish that goal. And you're also starting to review the relevant scholarly literature. But how do you pick a research question is a good question to ask if you're at that stage right now. First of all, it's important to figure out what each of these things mean, and more importantly, what they actually do within the paper. So in this little table, you've got the component of the paper on the left-hand column, and in the center, you've got a depiction about what its function really is in the paper. And on the right-hand column, I've given you an example of how this actually can work out. So what is the theory, or what is the function of the theory section of a paper, right? And the theory actually works as a framework or a lens to help you better understand an issue, the issue that is what you want to look at in your research paper. So, for example, basically, if you wanted to understand how people adjust to a new workplace, you would be utilizing organizational socialization theory. The literature review then is the entire body of previously published scholarly research that examines this issue you are interested in. So, for example, in the same example that we're dealing with, the issue is how people adjust to a new workplace, right? And so you will be looking at pretty much all of the prior published research about how people adjust to a new workplace. And then based on the theory and the literature review, you come up with a research question. And basically the research question is the specific question that you want to ask in this paper, your paper, based on this theory and review of relevant literature. So again, going back to our example of adjusting to a new workplace and organizational socialization, the research question that could develop from this is what communication behaviors help people adjust to a new job during the COVID-19 pandemic? So basically, what we're going to be now looking at is really how this toggling actually works in practice between now that we know the definitions and the uses of theory, literature review, and the research question. How do we sort of move across these three things? And the reason I chose the word toggling is really because I want to signify that we're not really necessarily talking about a specific sequence of events. In practice, the research process is far more messier than that. And so what you actually have in practice is a sort of multi-directional influence, whereas theory will, as you read more about the theory, it will impact the kind of review of the literature that you are doing. It will also impact the research question that you are asking. As you further build on your research question and refine it, that's going to also impact your focus on the theory in a particular way, and will probably also impact whether you add more to your literature review or maybe even shift your literature review in a different direction. And similarly, as you read more of the literature, that's when you start coming into contact with a lot more different theories, and you start figuring out which ones you can use. And that's also when you start realizing where the gap in research is, which helps you articulate your research question. So let's look at an example of how this actually might play out. And so this is the example If I'm sort of carrying on the same example that we had earlier, how people adjust to a new workplace, right? That's the issue that you're interested in. So starting with that issue, you will go through probably a list of different relevant journals and scholarly material to really focus on this particular issue, adjustment to new workplaces. As you are going through the literature, chances are you will come across, especially the communication literature, chances are you will come across repeated mentions of organizational socialization theory. And you will start to realize that this is a theory that is probably the best fit for, for this particular topic that you want to examine. So you will then sort of start reading more about organizational socialization theory, as well as continuing your review of the relevant literature. And as you are doing this, chances are you will sort of identify that a lot of current organizational socialization theory tends to focus on situations where there's a great deal of certainty. Society is not falling apart at the seams. Yes, a new job is uncertain in some respects, but other than that, the company is not necessarily going to go through a major rehaul or shift. Otherwise, if it were, chances are you wouldn't take on that job in the first place, right? So you'll find probably a research gap. And the research gap is that a lot of the organizational socialization theory work tends to look at job adjustments during certain times. And so there's far less research about job adjustments during uncertain or risky times. Now, as you realize this, a light bulb will probably go on in your brain. You'll say, you know what, this is really interesting. This is where I can make an important contribution to research. And so you start looking at the literature again in terms of how do people adjust to uncertain and risky times, because you start reasoning that the more research you can find about how this adjustment occurs during uncertain and risky times, you can combine that with socialization theory, which tends to look at the same issue, but in a very different spatial and temporal context. Well, as you start doing your review of the literature about how people adjust to uncertain and risky times, you're going to be sort of delving thoroughly into the risk communication theory frameworks. And so again, you're sort of toggling back between from literature review back to theory now, right? And as you start looking at the different risk communication theories, chances are you're probably going to focus on maybe one or two theories on the risk communication side, which you think are going to be a good fit for with socialization theory. But even as you are looking at risk communication theories, you're probably also thinking at this time about, well, we don't really know a lot about the risks posed to people in, ordinary people and organizations when it comes to this current COVID-19 pandemic that we are all in, right? And so now, again, you're toggling from theory to literature review. And you start reviewing some of the literature, the published literature, to really look at this perceived gap. How do people and organizations respond to the risks posed by the COVID-19 pandemic? What are the risks posed to organizational members in the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So you could think about social risks, economic risks, financial risks, health risks, a whole lot of different risks, and you could start reviewing this and combining this from your literature. So as you are going through all of this toggling process, right away, I mean, for me at least, it would suggest, a research question. And this research question slowly starts coming into shape. It starts becoming much more refined. And the final research question that you probably end up with would be something like this. What communication behaviors help people adjust to a new job during the COVID-19 pandemic? And this is So you can see from this example over here, although this particular diagram is, it's a straight downwards direction, you are toggling between literature review and theory, back to theory and literature, and then back again to theory, recognizing that there's a perceived gap, and that helps you create this research question. So there is this toggling going on across these levels. What does it look like on the paper, though? On the paper, now your next task is to sort of combine all of the stuff that you have been learning and present them in the standard theory, literature review, and then research question sections that you tend to see in scholarly papers around you. And so you gather and organize them. So in your theory section, you first want to talk about organizational socialization theory, and then identify the gap in this theory and say, well, it only tends to look at certain contexts. It doesn't tend to look at uncertain or risky times or situations. And that is why it makes sense to combine organizational socialization with risk communication theories to understand how socialization occurs during uncertain times. Your next part of your theory section will go into a lot of detail about risk communication. And maybe, you want to maybe focus on maybe a specific theory over there. The one that I have chosen is a social construction of risk theory, which really focuses a lot in terms of how the meanings of risk and the impact of risk are socially constructed through conversations. As you finish this section on theory, the next section will be about the literature review. So you want to talk about the context. What are the different kinds of risks that people are encountering, and how might this affect socialization or adjustment to new jobs? And so your literature review section often comes after theory. Sometimes in some papers, literature review precedes theory, but in this case, let's go with theory and then literature review. And your literature review section might also have two subsections. Your first subsection probably will focus on how will people adjust to new jobs amid uncertain or risky situations. And so this first subsection really looks at a variety of different uncertain and risk situations, and then talks about how job adjustment probably occurs in these situations based on what we know from prior published research. And then your second subsection will focus on the specific example of COVID-19 and the specific risks encountered by people during this COVID-19 pandemic. And then finally, you will highlight that because we don't yet know enough about how people adjust to new jobs amidst this COVID-19 pandemic, which is a risky situation, your research question for your paper is, what communication behaviors help people adjust to a new job during the COVID-19 pandemic? So the diagram on the right-hand side basically presents the same information, right? That it shows the process that you went through on the left-hand side, but it presents that in a very streamlined logical flow, which is expected in scholarly papers. But as you can tell, when you're actually figuring out the process of what to draw on for your research, what theory, what literature, how you will further refine and define your research question, it is a far messy process. So this is the actual messy process on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is how you are then going to arrange all the hard work that you have undertaken in the expected streamlined format of the scholarly paper. So what are some major takeaways as we end this webinar? First of all, toggling is really important because it allows you to identify the research gap or the contributions that your paper will make to the literature. If you do not toggle between your literature review and your theories and maybe the initial question that you actually had in mind, then you really would not be able to identify the contributions or the gap or even sort of end up with a really refined research question. So toggling between literature and theory and the question is really, really crucial. Toggling results in combining literatures and theories to help generate a new and impactful research question. Because keep in mind, the goal of research is to generate new knowledge. And you do that by creating new extensions and new ideas to existing theories. And again, you're not really going to be able to do that unless you really compare and contrast literature and theories so that you end up with a new and impactful research question. And finally, the actual process of research, which is toggling, is messy. It is a far cry from the very streamlined, finished product of research. However, once the toggling is done, it is time to present everything in this tripartite or three-level scheme to showcase a logical flow between theory, literature, and research question. So that's why I try to represent this visually on the right-hand side of this picture of this winding river. Toggling is sort of like a winding river, but you do need to sort of make those connections across those different bends of the river to argue about, and create that logical flow for your research paper. For more about how you can arrange your literature and your theory in this logical flow, you should refer back to webinar number 4, where I talk about arranging your literature review. That's it for now. Thank you so much. Have a great day.